One day, the disciple Peter came to Jesus and said, "Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive someone who really upsets me? Once? Twice? Even 7 times?" And Jesus said to Peter, "Well, Peter, I want you to think of a number that's too big to think of." And while Peter was scratching his head and trying to think of a number that was too big to think of, Jesus told him this story. Now, this story was set in a time when kings lived in castles and had lots of servants and lots of money. So Jesus said, "Once upon a time, Peter, there was a king. And that king had lots and lots of money. And one day, the king was looking through his accounts, working out who owed him money. And he came across the account of a servant who owed him so much money. Not just hundreds, not just thousands, but squillions of pounds. And the king said, "We'll have to do something about this." And so he summoned the servant to him. Now, this is the thing. The king knew that the servant couldn't pay. The servant knew that he couldn't pay. And the king knew that the servant knew that he couldn't pay, and the servant knew that the king knew that the servant knew that he couldn't pay, and it was just going to be a disaster. What was going to happen? He was going to lose his home, he was going to lose his family, he was going to lose everything he owned, right down to the socks he was wearing. Although, to be honest, they were a bit smelly and nobody wanted them. But everything was going to have to be sold to pay this debt. And the servant couldn't pay. And the servant came before the king, and he fell down on his knees, and he wept, and he cried, and he wailed, and he begged, and he said, "Have mercy on me, O king. I will do my best. I will pay you everything back." The king looked at the servant's account, and he knew that the servant would never, ever be able to pay it. But he was really sorry for this servant who was crying in front of him, and so deeply, deeply moved by the man's plea, the king took the servant's account, tore it in half, and said, "You are forgiven your debt. You may go free." Now, as you might imagine, the servant was now really, really happy. And he went on his way, And the day looked fantastic. It was a beautiful day to be alive. And he walked down the road with a spring in his step, whistling away, jangling the little bit of loose change that he had in his pocket, and knowing that he had enough. But then he met one of his fellow servants. And he looked at him and he said, "Hang on a minute, you owe me 50 quid. And his fellow servant said, "Well, I've not got it at the moment." And the servant was angry. He said, "You owe me 50 quid. I have just been humiliated and I am short of money. You owe me 50 quid. And he grabbed his fellow servant warmly by the throat. And his fellow servant said, "Have mercy on me and I will pay you everything back." But the first servant said, "Nope, if you can't pay me my money back, I'm going to have you flung into jail." And that's what he did. He had his fellow servant thrown into jail because he couldn't pay back the 50 quid. Now, one thing about this king was that he kept his ear to the ground. Now, that doesn't mean he walked around like this. It means that he always knew what was going on. And when he heard about the man being thrown into jail for 50 quid, the king was furious. And he summoned the servant back and he said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you not just a bit of money, I forgave you all that debt. And you could not forgive your fellow servant 50 quid. Well, I'm not having that. You, my friend, are going to go to jail yourself. And you will stay in jail until you have paid the very last penny that you owe me." And Jesus said to Peter, "This is how you will be treated by God if you do not forgive your brother and sister from the depths of your heart."